It's great to see so many of you here this morning, and it's of course wonderful that you are all having lively conversations at your tables as well. My name is Ute Pogrom, and I'm the Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities here at Northeastern, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you. As you know, we are here this morning for our annual Holocaust commemoration at Northeastern, a long tradition that has existed since the 1970s, and it is always a key element of our Holocaust Awareness Week. Each year, the events of the week are presented by Northeastern's Holocaust Awareness Committee and the Northeastern Humanities Center. And I want to thank the members of the Holocaust Awareness Committee, which consists of faculty, staff, and students, and especially its chair, Laurel Leff, for bringing us important and thought-provoking programs. The committee has organized this year's events under the important theme, Stories of Slave Labor and the Art of Freedom, and I urge you to look at the programming for the entire week. In fact, you will see that there is an exhibit that is associated with this week's events, stories of a young woman in a Nazi labor camp who was 16, letters from Sala. This is also a collaboration with Facing History, Facing Ourselves, and perhaps you could even set yourself the goal of bringing someone who might not normally go to such an exhibit, to that exhibit in International Village in order to see this compelling work. It is then my pleasure to introduce our provost, Provost Bean, who will give us some words of welcome.
I'm pleased to represent President Ayoun here today. His thoughts are with all of us in this commemoration. He's sorry that he could not be with us. Northeastern's Holocaust Awareness Week builds from a substantial tradition on campus. I just learned this morning that this breakfast began in the 1970s. At the same time, Holocaust Awareness Week is part of the university's broad commitment to diversity and inclusion and to building what we call civic sustainability on campus and in the world. President Ayoun's recent diversity and inclusion statement to the community and the prominent role of diversity and inclusion in the academic planning process attest to that. Unfortunately, we are commemorating today the 71st anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz this week. Many of the issues that are of such importance when we study and commemorate the Holocaust have continued to haunt us in recent decades. I'm thinking here of the Bosnian Wars in the 90s, of the genocide in Rwanda, and the persistence of religious strife and racism today, including anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, mass murder in Nigeria or Pakistan, and in the civil war in Syria. At Northeastern, we are very proud of that our community engages actively with the difficult questions that such events raise. We send students to Dialogues of Civilization, as well as on co-op to study and to do important work in many areas of conflict in the world. I was just hearing at the table again of some of the great examples of co-ops that are happening right now. For example, our Northeastern students have been or are currently on co-op in Cambodia, Northern Ireland, and Bosnia, and Serbia, also Jordan. They actively support NGOs dedicated to conflict resolution, or they support efforts to persecute perpetrators. For an example for that is in Belgrade. We're very proud that our students build on such experiences when they become leaders in the future. In the course of his career, President Ayoun has been very actively fostered engagement with the Holocaust. And he has repeatedly, most recently in last week's Martin Luther King Day address, urged us as members of the Northeastern community to be a model for society in matters of civility, diversity, and inclusion. Reflecting on past and present has to be an important part of these efforts. The commemoration today and the events that the Holocaust Awareness Committee is putting on for this week are among the many moments where we reflect at Northeastern. I look forward to hearing this morning about their research from this year's Gideon Klein scholar, Madelyn Stone, and from Professor Jeffrey Burds. Each has worked to transmit important lessons from the Holocaust. I want to add my thanks to the committee of faculty, staff, and students who are bringing us this week's formidable program, and I want to thank everyone for attending this morning.
Thank you, Provost Bean. As the Provost mentioned, Holocaust Awareness Week is something that we are conducting, and our commemoration of the Holocaust is connected to January 27. I think I better step aside here again. Is connected to January 27, which is the day that marks the 71st anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, and that day is International Holocaust Remembrance Day. As you also may know, Jewish Studies is currently, together with the Holocaust Awareness Committee and the libraries, engaged in a process of, in fact, making sure that the long history of these commemorations is something that remains known to our communities. Very exciting work that is going on between the public history program, the libraries, and Jewish Studies. Now, all of you, of course, recognize that my accent is a German accent, and many of you may also know that I am a historian of Germany with a teaching specialization on the Holocaust and comparative genocide. And so it is for personal and professional reasons that it is important to me to be at a university that combines commemoration of the Holocaust, the murder of 6 million Jews at the hands of Germans and their collaborators during World War II, with asking important questions about the Holocaust, about trauma and memory, questions that are also applicable beyond German and Jewish history. 3 years ago, the author Daniel Mendelsohn raised an important and provocative question when he spoke as Morton lecturer here at Northeastern. What he asked was whether the injunction to never forget puts us at risk of forgetting individual stories as they are reshaped into the large, manageable parables that cultures need to live by. The spirit of the events that our Holocaust Awareness Committee has put together is very much one of not going by simple parables, but rather of acknowledging individual stories, analyzing individual stories, and also acknowledging the difficult and messy questions that the Holocaust continues to raise. Questions about the breakdown of relations between neighbors that were part of the enactment of the Holocaust and that also characterize other genocides. Questions about the responsibilities of bystanders, questions about the responsibilities of those who were under Nazi occupation and those who were not. Also questions about the difficulties of resistance, questions about how to come to terms with trauma, questions about art and resilience in the face of horror. As in other years, our gathering this morning features reflections from members of our Northeastern community. A student this year is Gideon Klein, scholar Madelyn, and a faculty member, my colleague in the history department, Jeffrey Burds. We can be sure that each will integrate individual stories and suffering with larger questions. It's now my honor to present to you Laurel Leff, the chair of the Holocaust Awareness Committee. Professor Leff teaches in the School of Journalism at Northeastern, and she is also an associate director of our Northeastern Jewish Studies program. Her research and publications focus on American responses to the Holocaust, and recently especially on responsibilities of nations, states, and individuals towards refugees, an issue that, as you know, has not gone away as an important question of our time. Professor Leff will guide you through our program this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Plager and Provost Beam, both for your remarks and also for your continuing support of the Holocaust Awareness Committee and all of the work that we do. Every year at this commemoration, I am always proud of our student who has received the Gideon Klein Award to research an artist who died in the Holocaust and to make a presentation on his or her life. This year, I am even more proud because Madelyn is not just one of our students, she's one of my students, and one of the best I've had in 20 years teaching at Northeastern. There are two people in the audience who are even more justifiably proud. Madelyn's parents, Bart Stone and Mary Lynn Stone, you could just wave or something, who are here from the snowy climes of North Carolina. Amazing that they're coming to the nice weather we're having here in Boston. Madelyn started as a journalism major and then added a major in history and a minor in international affairs to her extremely accomplished academic career. I've had her in one journalism class and one history class in America and the Holocaust. In both, she stood out not only for her academic gifts, but for her deep empathy and penetrating insights, both of which are on display in today's presentation. As an undergraduate, she has already begun to develop a specialty in artists and intellectuals who endured life under repressive regimes. She has helped me research 2 female academics who struggled during the Nazi era, and for an international co-op, she worked in Cape Town, South Africa, preparing online biographies of artists during the apartheid era. I am both a little disappointed and immensely delighted that Madelyn has decided to pursue a PhD in history rather than a journalism career. Here's what I know for certain: it will be a great one. I'm looking forward to the day when Madelyn will not just be my former student, but also my professional colleague. Madelyn.
Jura Soyfer wrote his final piece as a prisoner, a poem, lyrics set to music by composer and fellow inmate Herbert Zipper. Dachau song resonated with the themes that had occupied Soyfer's work throughout his 26 years. In the yard of the concentration camp, 6 months before the outbreak of World War II, where the largely political prisoners found their freedom curtailed to the most extreme degree, the men sang the verses with recognition of their satiric force. The words spoke powerfully to this most extreme case of oppression. They hold a resonance today, even beyond their historic and literary value. The dictum Arbeit macht frei posed a dark irony against the landscape of 1930s Western Europe, but the glint of humor and hope in the critical awareness of this irony allowed meaning in a reality that felt like satire itself. Jura Soyfer, or Yuri as he was called, was born in Kharkov, the first capital of Ukraine, on December 8, 1912. His parents were secular Jews, his father a middle-class businessman. The governess they hired for Soyfer and his sister taught them French. At the age of 7, he became a refugee, his family fleeing the Russian Revolution via Georgia. They finally settled in Vienna. Soyfer soon became fluent in German and popular in school for the humorous sketches he wrote as diversions. The Vienna of this time was a liberalizing place. Under social democratic control, the Red Vienna of 1918 to 1934 proved an island of affluence and intellectualism compared to the poor, conservative, clerical countryside surrounding it. Economic and political uncertainty beleaguered the city like most other centers of the time, and threats of extreme conservatism loomed, but liberalism temporarily predominated. Women had achieved suffrage and were active in parliament. For the first time in Austrian history, Jews had equal access to state office. At school, Soyfer came into contact with the Association of Socialist Middle School Students. He was 14 when Vienna's Palace of Justice went up in flames. 6 months after a clash between right and left-wing paramilitary groups left an 8-year-old boy and a working-class war veteran dead, a jury acquitted the conservative defendants despite their confessions of guilt. Riots of protest broke out spontaneously, consuming the city. Mobs charged City Hall, the Opera House, and police headquarters. They set fire to the law courts and burned the offices of the Prime Minister's party newspaper. Police and military fired on the crowds and burned the offices of the Prime Minister's party newspaper. They fired on the crowds, leaving 85 protesters dead and hundreds wounded. The violence and ensuing strikes paralyzed the city only temporarily, but the impact lodged itself in political consciousness, seeding a civil war still 7 years in the future. The events of 1927 embedded themselves in Soyfer's consciousness as well. He became politically active and began writing poetry from age 14. At 17, he joined his high school socialist organization. The same year, he started writing for cabaret productions. In 1931, he enrolled at the University of Vienna to study history and German, 2 subjects particularly prone to the distortions of Nazi influence. The university itself propagated anti-democratic politics and anti-Semitism, ideologies increasingly entangled with racial discrimination. While at university, Soyfer began publishing in the Socialist Social Democratic Party's prestigious workers' newspaper, the Arbeiterzeitung, known for its quality journalism. As a mouthpiece for the liberal political party, the Viennese publication and his pieces had an obvious agenda, but Soyfer's touch was light. His involvement in full-fledged communist propaganda likely did not extend beyond a single handbill he authored anonymously. Biting references to the Austrian political scene tie much of his writing to its time and place, references to figures and events enriching his work for his specific audience. In one February 1932 poem, just 32 lines long, he references a nearby coal mining town's economic struggles, Austria's persisting job shortages, the politically fueled banking crisis of 1929, the exploitation of the unemployed paid to march in right-wing Heimwehr marches, and the corruption of high-salaried bank directors in the midst of economic turmoil, among other things. Each stanza ends with the opening lines of what was then Austria's national anthem, roughly, "Blessed be endlessly, wonderful native land." Obscure now, the reference is tapped in irony, intelligible on any level, still provocatively clear, and is clearly provocative. The same year, Soyfer made a trip to Berlin as a correspondent for the Arbeiterzeitung. His letters home to his then-girlfriend Marika Schüssel speak of his anxieties as an aspiring correspondent, desperate to write articles with the meaning he sought and the caliber to support himself financially. He describes hearing Hitler speak. "I was flabbergasted at the inanity and brutality of this mass enchanter, dieses Massenbezauberers." The coined word evokes the sense of caricature Soyfer must have sensed in real life, aware of the then-candidate's theatricality and his own averse resistance to the pandering, melodramatic oral tactics. In the same letter, his broader sympathies are explicit. Quote, "The working class of Germany has revolutionized through and through, and tears come to your eyes when you see how these magnificent proletarians must go out with all their fighting energy at the unemployment offices, because Wels is Wels and Theilmann is Theilmann," making reference to two liberal German politicians who were unable to fend off far-right encroachment. Soyfer filed 5 articles for the Arbeiterzeitung from Germany in 1932. His briefs restricted political editorializing, since he was only an occasional correspondent and did not have much stature. Still, the assignment gave him his break into writing pieces that he had been chasing. By the end of his trip, his confidence had buoyed, evident in one of his letters to Schüssel. Quote, "At least I have soundly kicked in the wall that separated me from the Arbeiterzeitung's front page." Soyfer continued writing journalistic pieces for the next 5 years, filing his last report from prison in November 1937. He wrote in many other forms over the same years. His writings span a broad range of genre, short and long prose, poetry and lyrics, reports and reviews, opinions and critiques, letters and dramas. Even writing as prolifically as he did, he tutored on the side just to make ends meet. The English poet John Lehman, working as a journalist in Vienna, took Russian lessons from Soyfer. He also had a secret cupboard built in his apartment for the stacks of illegal political pamphlets Soyfer supplied him. Lehman described him vividly, quote, "Jura Soyfer was a delicate-looking man of just under average height, in his middle 20s. He had a soft voice, a gentle expression, and great charm of manner. But under this mild exterior he concealed, as I was later to realize, not only a subtle understanding of his fellow men, but also a strong will and cool courage. His family was poor, and he earned far too little himself to live an even averagely comfortable life, but I never once heard him complain about it. His work as a poet and the pursuit of his political ideals absorbed him entirely." Censorship increasingly circumscribed what Soyfer could publish, perhaps nowhere more distinctly than in the case of his novel. He called it "Thus Died a Party," and considered it his most important work. He started on the manuscript in the wake of the February 1934 uprisings, when the government's ensuing clampdown banned the Social Democratic Party and Austrofascism took hold. Based on a few chapters Soyfer showed him, Lehman called it "the real thing." Quote, "I was particularly struck by the sensitive skill Jura had shown in creating atmosphere and conveying the erratic psychological weather of a group of characters waiting for a battle to begin." Tragically, the book itself became a permanent victim of its time. Authorities destroyed the manuscript when they first arrested Soyfer in 1937, and it now exists only in the fragment John Lehman preserved. Fortunately, much of his work did make it to publication and survives intact. His poems appeared every Saturday in the pages of the Arbeiterzeitung, which had 80,000 readers. The pieces often ran alongside political cartoons, expanding on their incisive commentary. He also published in the Social Democratic Illustrated Weekly magazine, Der Kuckuck. Largely political, the verses pressed the bounds of acceptability, even in Vienna's liberal years. Pragmatic but not pessimistic, ever the hopeful cynic, he touched on the ironies of the political and socioeconomic situation with insight that made the absurd readily apparent. Soyfer did not limit his commentary to Europe. His references to issues in the US are just as insightful and at least as intriguing, though he never set foot on American soil. In Shantytown, a 1933 poem, he invaded the contradiction of New York City, seeming capital of the world with the largest circulation of money, yet filled with unemployed workers living in marginalized shantytowns. He called for racial equality, an object lesson in race theory. This 1933 poem, published in Der Kuckuck in the format of a verse commentary accompanying a photograph, describes two men, one black, one white, waiting outside a welfare office. Each is unemployed, we are told, quote, but all that sameness doesn't count. Hair and skin are paramount. Soyfer also scorned the subtler hypocrisy in honoring a working-class mother with an official welfare handout on Mother's Day, a specifically American invention. He spoke out against the handling of the Sacco and Vanzetti case and the Scottsboro trial. He ridiculed Washington's treatment of World War I veterans left without promised bonus payments. Quote, in Washington, people were irritated because the unemployed called for food. Like the insight of his irony, the literary quality of his poems and his prose resonates timelessly. In a poem published in the Arbeiter Zeitung in January 1933, titled Lullaby for an Unborn Baby, Soyfer's lyrics probe issues still uncomfortable and contentious today. Sleep, baby, sleep. The state protects its sheep. Abortion cannot harm you. The state needs you to arm you. In war, the graves are wide and deep. Sleep, baby, sleep. 2 months after this poem's publication, Austria's fascist chancellor, Engelbert Dollfuss, invoked an emergency decree to declare his absolute power. Dollfuss's press laws required the inspection of newspapers 2 hours before circulation. Local judicial and police officials monitored the papers, excising any copy that might cause so-called injury to patriotic, religious, or cultural sensibilities. Large sections of the Arbeiter Zeitung began disappearing entirely, the empty spaces speaking loudly of a deepening societal divide. Its journalists took the blows in stride, mocking their short-statured chancellor in cartoons. In one, Dollfuss presses his face in seeming disbelief against the front page of the newspaper, so clear it has become a mirror displaying only his reflection. Soyfer's work was growing more dangerous, yet he persisted in his critiques, writing some more incisive than ever. As late as April 23, 1933, he published pointed satirical barbs of the Nazi Party. His poem Heil Hitler, printed in Der Kuckuck, posed his themes candidly. Germany, Germany, shouting Heil! Did you ever ask yourself why? You let them fool you. You let them win. Now years of slavery begin. Years of blood will come over the land. Then you'll understand. The poem's darkness strikes a sharp dissonance to Soyfer's work after censorship intensified in 1934. It was then he turned to the cabaret for artistic expression. In the literally underground theaters of Vienna, cropping up in the basements of coffee houses, Soyfer's sketches and plays allegorized the troubling shifts he saw around him. In his plays, unemployed young people travel thousands of years into the past to discover the reason they can't find jobs. A diver explores an underwater dystopia of oblivion, where no one remembers how to feel love or hate, hope or despair. The play's farcical couching in the model of old Viennese popular comedies cleared the censors, who sat in on dress rehearsals. The resonances of criticism for the fascist ascension were and are scathing, even in the creatively indirect ways Soyfer was forced to express them. His first major stage debut, Der Weltuntergang, encapsulated many of the themes that made his work dangerously relevant. In English, The End of the World, or Doomsday, this production premiered on the underground cabaret stages of Vienna in 1936. Even as German forces occupied the Rhineland, Berlin propagandized the world at the Olympic Games, and the Nazi Reichstag placed the Gestapo above the law. The play posited an impending doomsday averted through compassion. The comet that a personified solar system sends hurtling towards Earth falls in love with the planet and turns away. The comet's final soliloquy expresses the contradictions Soyfer must have felt in his own environment of anguish and artistry. Full of hunger and full of bread is this world, full of life and full of death is this world, limitless in wealth and beggary. Blessed and cursed is this world, radiant with beauty and health is this world, and its future is grand and lovely. Satirizing a darkening political reality, tempered by the optimism of a young writer bold enough to criticize an authoritarian regime, the play offered a redemptive resolution that its author would fail to find in his own lifetime. A View on the End of the World featured in another play called Broadway-Melodie 1492, in which Soyfer parodied the legend of Christopher Columbus. His rendition overlaid references to fascism on the story of the 15th century mercenary, whose feverish ambition drove the New World Discovery Project and its genocidal nature. Horst Jarke, Soyfer's most exhaustive biographer, translator, and critic, has noted Soyfer was not immune to the common tendency to trivialize the object of ridicule through humorous critique. Quote, "But more than any other satirist in the Arbeiter Zeitung, he drew revolutionary conclusions from his satiric exposure of the enemy, incited his readers to fight fascism in Austria, and he clearly foresaw that Hitler's politics, if not stopped, would inevitably lead to war." Still, as the optimistic conclusion of his plays suggest, he kept alive the hope that the worst fate will ultimately be averted. All of his plays, in fact, despite their dark ironies and scathing social critiques, conclude with open-endedness. Soyfer's faith in humanity illuminates a brighter path for the future, without denying the gravity and the problems of the present. This present was a time that both made and destroyed him. In his will to confront controversy, both in his use of words as weapons, Soyfer took on a tide he knew he could not reverse. He entreated his audience for awareness, for empathy, for reason, yet he knew all too well the depth of the absurdity that any appeal to rationality had to face. His work was a recognition of the irony of life, which needs no distorting. Horst Jarke put it succinctly, quote, "Reality is the satire." In a tragically apt way, Soyfer's own story turned on ironies he might have concocted for a stage farce. Tailed by police who mistook him for the head of the left's propaganda machine, he confirmed their erring suspicion with the content of his plays. When the officers apprehended him, the materials they found in his apartment gave them reason enough for an arrest, even after they realized their mistake. An amnesty program secured his release after 3 months, just before Nazi Germany invaded and absorbed Austria in the 1938 Anschluss, leading to increasingly heightened repression. When Soyfer tried to escape with a friend by skiing over the Swiss border, he was rearrested, the half-finished play in his bag confiscated and lost. He was taken to Dachau and later Buchenwald, where his forced labor included moving corpses. Behind the archival record of orderly documents, structured with ticked boxes and signatures, the chaos of a warped reality took the oppression and suffering he already knew to an extreme. After 4 months in Buchenwald, he contracted the typhus that would kill him on February 16, 1939, at age 26. While studying Soyfer and his work, I found myself wincing at the arbitrary circumstances of his death, the narrowly missed opportunities that only cumulatively prevented him from escaping to a presumably long and productive life abroad. Still 6 months from the outbreak of war, his friends had been able to procure a visa for him to enter the US, but the typhus claimed him just days before his anticipated release. Along with 11 million innocents, including 6 million other Jews, he suffered a senseless death, brutally cutting his story short. In researching his life and work, I felt overwhelmed by the sense of loss these incomprehensible numbers represent when examined at a focused and individual level. How many other lives deserve deeper consideration? How many other individuals would have demanded scholarly attention had they been allowed to mature and create freely? Discovering the details of his life has been eye-opening in literary, historical, and personal ways. I am so grateful to the Gideon Klein Scholarship for allowing me the opportunity to make this journey. I've deeply appreciated having the means to access texts on his writings and to peruse his concentration camp records at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C., and to receive the astute mentorship of Professor Laura Leff all along the way. My journey in tracing Soyfer's story has been inspiring and humbling. It has distressed me to think of the degree to which his death defines his life. At such a young age, with such an abruptly interrupted career, he left a legacy both easier to discount and harder to ignore. The satire in his own reality is troubling and telling, and his voice's persistence, despite the fascist authority's censorship and ultimate murder, there is an irony that complicates perceptions of satire itself. Soyfer's aspirations to find the humor and the hope in the darkest of situations seems at once admirable and dangerous. Even in the concentration camp, the seeming epitome of cruelty and repression, he managed to subvert the strictures and affirm a sense of self. He colluded with fellow prisoners in expressions of culture and resilience, a creator and comrade to the end. His friend and fellow prisoner, the composer Herbert Zipper, remembered how he and Soyfer endured by focusing on the outside world more than on their inner fears, how they felt being in the camp had irrevocably changed them, and how Soyfer planned to write about his experiences. He remembered how Soyfer and he smuggled water to restrain prisoners, how they volunteered for grisly tasks just to witness and experience what was happening in the camp. While carrying bodies from the sick ward, already ill with typhus himself, Soyfer gave Zipper French lessons. In the midst of so much deprivation and death, Soyfer continued to write cabaret pieces that the prisoners performed to the grudging admiration of the guards. As one fellow inmate described to John Lehman, quote, Jura, the gentle, smiling, fragile intellectual, had developed into a tower of physical strength and spiritual endurance. While at Dachau, Soyfer wrote the lyrics of a song that would go on to become his most famous legacy. He conceived the lyrics as a way to raise morale, composing them in the style of his satiric poems and reciting the piece to Herbert Zipper to set to music. The lyrics reclaim the irony of the infamous cast-iron phrase, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. The lyrics and the taunting expression of feudal propaganda was soldiered into the gates of Dachau as it was at Auschwitz and other concentration camps. Called simply Dachau Lied, Dachau Song, the song's verses confront the sick contradictions in the camp and in the world around him. The song spread throughout the camp and beyond, to an extent Soyfer could hardly have anticipated. Dachau Lied became the source of the title for a 1942 anti-Nazi propaganda film produced by the British Ministry of Information called Lift Your Head, Comrade. It features as a battle song that Jewish émigrés in the British Army sing in solidarity with the anti-fascist cause.
Listen to this song. It is sung to this very day by the prisoners in the concentration camp at Dachau. It was written by a young Austrian poet in the camp, whom the SS men eventually killed. Pitiless the barbed wire. All around us charged with death. Keep your step, comrade. Lift your head, comrade. And always think of the day, comrade, when the bells of freedom will ring.
It has been published and performed many times since. A driving rhythm presses the words forward, elevating their lyricism. The resilience, the yearning of the human spirit towards freedom resonates in the shifting keys. The resilience of sincere expression in the face of senseless suffering echoes in the marching beat. Cynicism melds with aspiration, accumulating in a catchy complexity that resonates long after the final chords. The slogan of Dachau is burnt on our brains, and unyielding as steel we shall be. Are we men, brother? Then we'll be men when they've done. Work on. We'll go through with the task we've begun. For work, brother, work makes us free.
Thank you so much, Madelyn. That was wonderful. If we have time for questions, we'll do both questions for both speakers at the end of Professor Burds' presentation. So I hope we have time. We'll see. I also take particular pleasure in introducing history professor Jeffrey Burds, who will deliver our keynote presentation. I should start by saying that Jeff is Madelyn's honors thesis advisor, so he can take a bit of the credit for her brilliant presentation that we just heard. Jeff does what, frankly, I could never do. He goes to the deepest, darkest places where the Holocaust happened, and I mean that on both a literal and a metaphorical level, and shows us the most horrifying aspects of what I hesitate to call humanity. He does that in his books, including the chilling, hard to read, but have to read, Holocaust in Rovno, and a forthcoming publication on communist collaboration under German occupation, and in his many articles, including one on sexual violence in Europe during World War II. He does that by teaching Northeastern students about the history of this period and taking them on study trips to Poland and Germany. And he'll take us there in today's presentation on a July 1941 pogrom in the Ukraine that left 3,000 Jews dead in one day. Jeff has the academic background to go on such difficult journeys. He has the research and the linguistic skills, but mostly he has the courage and the deep conviction that it must be done. I present Professor Jeffrey Burds.
Thank you for being here today. I was especially proud of both Laurel and Madelyn during that really fine talk. I am grateful to the Holocaust Awareness Committee for inviting me. The themes I deal with, as Laurel has explained, is to go deeply into the microhistory of the Holocaust, but as international history. What does that mean? I'm kind of an archive rat. That's a Russian phrase, basically, somebody who reads a lot of archives, hundreds of thousands of pages, I suppose, on the theme that I'll talk about for 20 minutes today. It's taken me 20 years to get as far as I've come. I'm still waiting to get access to KGB interrogation files with some of the perpetrators which exist, but because of the politics of Ukrainian nationalism in post-Soviet Ukraine, obstacles are put in my way, so I'm trying to be patient and wait for the moment when those files are available to finally publish on a theme I've been talking about for years. The subject of my research is described as communities of violence, explained by Rabbi Emanuel Levinas in Totality and Infinity, where he identifies the act of violence itself in moments like pogroms as an ontological event, meaning it's something that has a deeper meaning than simply the act itself, not just the moment of violence, but the changing life trajectories of the perpetrators, the victims, the bystanders alike, that became the nexus for transforming individuals and communities of violence. And just as Dean Poiger talked about, when we focus on individuals, which we can now do finally 70 years after the Holocaust, to look not just at Ukrainians versus Jews, as in this case, but individual Ukrainian perpetrators, individual Jewish victims, as we saw just now in Madelyn's talk. That is to take it from the general to the specific, to teach us lessons about humanity or inhumanity. As Rabbi Levinas wrote, violence does not consist so much in injuring and annihilating persons as in interrupting their continuity, making them play roles in which they no longer recognize themselves, making them betray not only commitments, but their own substance. What we're talking about is children who grow into adults, never intending to become perpetrators, who one day find themselves crossing that line, and then how they cope with those moments of violence the rest of their lives. The bystanders who observe it, the victims who experience it, who then, in more cases than I care to admit, cannot talk about it because they've been so shattered psychically by the experiences they've had. So that when I try to draw from oral history, interviewing people, it took me, in one case, 15 years to track down a 9-year-old girl who was present in yet another pogrom in the summer of 1941, found her 2.5 hours away. She changed her name 3 times for security, changed her religion multiple times, and we spent Passover together in 2008. But the persistence that it takes to find the individual voices who can then comment on the archival files is part of what I believe is the domain of the international historian of the Holocaust, who looks not just in Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Germany, Great Britain, the United States, Israel, anywhere where you can find photos or documents to talk about these events. My friend at Yale, Libby Wood, talks about repertoires of violence, how individual perpetrators are drawing from their own culture, their own history, in order to apply violence in these moments. And somehow they all know the rules, but they're tacit. We cannot, as outsiders, understand what those rules mean until we observe them. And this is why I tend to do in-your-face talks that you can't forget. Because the images themselves are going to sear themselves into your own hearts and souls, as mine have been somehow damaged over the course of the years, in order to bring you to a certain level of consciousness. As a social scientist, I advocate fighting the gag reflex that's natural, but at the same time, you're going to find that I, too, make certain concessions to decency, not allowing the humiliation, in particular, of Jewish men and women to become pornographic images today. It's something of a matter of conscience. For those who do not specialize in the history of violence in Eastern Europe, I think it's very difficult to understand the degree to which genocide and ethnic or religious cleansing in the East are hate crimes perpetrated not against random strangers, but more often than not, targeting personal contexts. Jan Gross's poignant observations of multi-ethnic Western Ukraine, southeastern Poland, just prior to World War II, I think are especially relevant here. In these easternmost hinterlands of interwar Europe, each hamlet or village was to a large degree an isolated universe. As often happens in such an environment, intense personal hatreds were harbored, and an ethnic and religious component gave them the potential to engulf entire communities. Yet much as the violence represented an explosion of combined ethnic, religious, and nationalist conflict, I am nevertheless struck by its intimacy. More often than not, victims and executioners knew each other personally. Even after several years, survivors could still name names. Definitely people took this opportunity to get even for personal injuries in the past. 20 minutes isn't a lot of time. I've already used 3 of them, and so I'm going to try to take you through a whirlwind of images constructed from private and public collections over the last 20 years to describe one event, the murder of 3,000 Jewish men and women 6 months before the final solution was adopted at Wannsee. Why is this occurring in the first week of the war in the East if there was not some sort of master plan in advance? The questions and the answers, I think, will come forward. The sources begin with 27 photos that were collected anonymously from the Weiner Library, basically. The story behind them is there was a Wehrmacht, a German military soldier, there that day, July 4th, 1941, in Lemberg, Lvov, Lviv, Western Ukraine, the capital of Galicia, observing the events, and he went mad, literally, at the horrors that he saw. But he recorded it with his Leica camera, took it home, printed it out, and had it in his footlocker for over 30 years. He spent in a mental hospital in Germany. When he died in the mid-70s, his nurses went through his footlocker, found the photos, and were so horrified they showed the doctor. The doctor himself decided to take them and hide them in a file because they were all convinced that German government would never release them. They would be destroyed or lost somehow. The doctor sat on these photos for another 25, 30 years until 2001 when he anonymously donated them to the Weiner Library so they would get out in the West. Some of the photos I'm sure you've seen because they've become literally the main source, our main template for understanding issues like rape warfare or the oppression of human beings during the worst times of war, what we call total war or everyday life. Besides those 27 photos, there are all kinds of other sources I won't go into detail now, private and public collections from 8 different countries that I've drawn different photos from in order to provide materials. And in addition, a graduate student at Harvard who saw a presentation I did years ago, happened to be in Toronto, happened to get access to a lost film from Alpine Mountain Unit 2 that was in Lemberg that day. Their cameraman basically filmed things and shared these materials with me. I interspersed there, and probably 150, 200 people have seen these films that have not been released to the public yet, but they give you a sense of how, when you do a dogged persistence to find the truth in these microhistories, eventually you do. Mikhail Bakhtin is an expert, of course, on semiotics, which is the study of signs and symbols and cultural interpretation. And a lot of my understanding of what we're about to see comes from his book, Rabelais and His World, where he talks about the embedding within national cultures these moments of violent history. And so what it means is we as historians have to look at this, study it closely as social scientists, but also go into it more deeply to understand where are all these horrible things being taken from? Where will they lead in the future? And what are other examples to compare them? Bakhtin wrote, Carnival in particular, it's not a spectacle seen by the people, they live in it, and everyone participates because its very idea embraces all the people. While Carnival lasts, there is no other life outside of it. So I'm not talking about German perpetrated violence as such, I'm talking about Ukrainian violence on Jewish neighbors in the first week of the war, in the summer of 1941. And with that, I'll begin. This is St. Yuri's Cathedral. I was married there in June of 1941. The pro-Hitler, anti-Banderite, or pro-Banderite posters and things obviously weren't up there, but they were probably placed by my grandfather-in-law, who, after we got married, I found out I had married into a Nazi collaborationist family, which is part of what helped me to improve my knowledge of history, I suppose. This is simply a map to show you where we're going to look at this point. In particular, Brigitki Prison Massacre Site, one of 3 NKVD prisons in downtown Lviv that were used to attack potential fifth columnists, and in particular in the last year before the war, Stalin will order the arrest of potential fifth columnists in this zone. He's afraid of escalating on the Eastern Front, and so he wants to imprison as many as possible. About 9,000 of these prisoners will be killed in the week between the Nazi invasion, June 22nd, and the arrival of the Germans on the early morning, about 4 a.m., of the initial Alpine mountain units and other support units for the Germans. We begin with the first image from that soldier who was recounting all of this with his Leica camera that day, showing people not at all afraid that the Germans are coming. The Germans are perceived as liberators as the initial German staff cars come in down Main Street, and then the German troops begin to walk in. And you see that the crowds are peopled with children and women. This is, again, not a sense of being conquered, it's a sense of being liberated. And how do we welcome these German liberators? You don't let your children out in a wartime situation if you're afraid in any way. The prisoners of war who are also marched as in order to be demonized as part of the vilification of the enemy during these early days. And of course, the selfies of 1941, Franz taking pictures of his buddy taking pictures of him. We see Leica cameras everywhere. Over 14 million German soldiers will see action on the Eastern Front. We believe probably 10 million had Leica cameras. And so things like eBay Deutschland, which has been a great source for materials for me, appears because suddenly there's value in Grandpa's photos that had been buried for so many years and not simply collectors. Now we turn to this first section of the Alpine Mountain Unit as it walks in on the morning about 4:30 in the morning on July 1st, 1941. And I'm not sure why it's not running. It's on my laptop, so there must be software in the background that's creating issues. So let's try to do it again. Sorry. My laptop works. I'm sure it's something else. So what I'll do is pardon me?
Maybe you can run it outside of PowerPoint.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I'll try that. Then I have to know where it was in the many. Let's see. All right, I apologize. It's not working there either. Let me try. There's one more version. Germans enter Lviv, that one. I think probably this is the first time I've run a public lecture since upgrading to Windows 10. My guess is that the software doesn't know where to go, so I'm afraid. It works for me on my own system, but it's not loading with the, oh, there it is, okay. Okay, so what you see, there's no sound to the film. As this Alpine Mountain unit, the elite unit, number 2, is walking in, and they take time for anti-Soviet iconoclasm to show the local people, this is what we stand for. We are not an army in the traditional sense coming to conquer Ukraine. We are Ukrainians' friends against the so-called Žydų komuna, the Jewish communist conspiracy. We are here as liberators, and so this is why they attack. People are greeting them as liberators, and you'll see one young Ukrainian woman in particular who's quite pleased that the German soldiers have come in. You see the applause and the connection between photos, so these are not isolated moments. These are real moments. Okay. Go back. The Carnivalesque Rabelaisian moment begins with a series of theatrical moments. Clearly, the Germans want to help to put on a movement. These are mostly, as we'll see later in the talk, advanced troops or people who've been trained specially in the year before on how to run a pogrom, and we will dissect that part of it down the line. It begins with the exhumations in the courtyards of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. They call out able-bodied Jewish men aged 16 to 40 to come out to dig out these areas, and people are watching as it's going on. You see in the audience around, because of the stench of the freshly killed, freshly buried corpses that are now being brought out, and sometimes actions occur and they begin to attack. This is actually now an official German propaganda photo as they start to go in. This is now the courtyard where wave after wave of Ukrainian nationalists were brought in and shot by a shoestring group of Soviets, or of Soviet soldiers and secret policemen. These are from yet another scrapbook showing that this is all very publicized. The bodies are brought out, the locals come in and look, and they get outraged. What happens with this, and these are again German propaganda photos, how are the Germans presenting this in the illustrated press back in Berlin? This is one example of a leaflet I found at the Holocaust Museum, basically talking about the justice that the Germans are bringing against the Jews. And this is the nature of the theater we're talking about. Popular justice, Ukrainian justice, bringing to bear against the Žydų komuna, the Jewish communist conspiracy. Another film that we may be able to watch on the other side. And that's the last of the films I'll do then, because and what's most amazing, remember that these are the raw footage of the Alpine Mountain Unit photographer, and he's filming them. Every time a German steps in, he's self-editing. And so he's deliberately cutting out the presence of the Germans. Sometimes he'll ask them to move. Sometimes, presumably, they correct this later down the line. That is, in fact, what they do in the presentations and newsreels back in Germany. People are going around identifying, because we are all pretty much experts now, CSI experts, we understand that after a few days people may not be recognizable. For the most part, they're recognizable on the basis of their clothing, and so people are reacting, and you could see in the background in that film as people rise up. It becomes, at this point, a public spectacle, something you bring your children to. And I believe the foundation of modern Ukrainian nationalism begins in this moment, because this becomes the overriding self-explanation of what happened during this period, getting even with the Stalinists in this way. You see here how a father and a son are staring at what Stalin has done to our neighbors and friends. The newspapers in Ukrainian over the course of the summer and the next year will include detailed forensic analysis of how the bodies themselves were treated. The Germans, the Wehrmacht, will lend their own forces in order to create burial sites, victims of Soviet repression that are destroyed, bulldozed by the Soviets in 1944-45, recreated by independent nations, Ukraine and the Baltic states especially, in 1991 and thereafter. Now, the specific, and they even bring out and have funeral dirges and the like as it's playing out. These are just the first and last page of an SD, a German secret police report that talks about the ethnic cleansing of the corpses, how they sent in a particular unit for Brigidki prison, that is the Nachtigall unit of Ukrainians who were trained in southeastern Poland the summer before, who come in as parachutists, visit the prison, and they find the Jewish bodies, 33 of them. They take them out so that people won't feel sorry for the dead Jews that the Soviets killed, and instead identify this as a Soviet Jewish attack against the Ukrainian people as such. Part of the antecedent to the pogrom, part two, has to do with what I call rituals of transformation. German soldiers, in this case, you can identify in particular the hat of the Edelweiss on the hat of a member of the Alpine Mountain Unit. And in a series of photos that I won't show, they're doctoring it. They're saying, okay, tear up the Khrushchev photo. They want to take pictures of iconoclasm. So they're editing the moment at this time in real time. One of the most powerful photos is this one. The Jews of Lemberg are forced in various ways in humiliation rituals. If you look closely at the pictures of the faces in the background, only one of them is crying without exception. The local mass is greatly in support of this inversion and humiliation ritual. This picture is owned by a journalist in Philadelphia whose mother was in the sewers below at age 16, hiding out for the next 16 months from the Germans. Another favorite treat was to have Jews participate in the iconoclastic attack against images of Soviet power, in this case the picture of, or the statue of Lenin in the general headquarters of the military. One of the most powerful sequences of photos, though, that I've found through the years is in a scrapbook of a German journalist who didn't quite know what was going on but decided to take a picture anyway. Around the corner behind the scene on Zamartinovska Street on 1 July 1941 is the largest synagogue back then in Lviv, in Lemberg. What they do is they take the Ark of the Covenant that held the Torah, they take Jewish leaders that they could find, and they put a pig in that Ark, and they have the Jewish leaders carry this pig. On the stretcher itself, the Ark, are pictures of Molotov and the idea of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that this has sold out the people in this area. Jewish women are asked to carry images of Soviet power in one way or another. But you see, again, this is a happy time for those non-Jews who are laughing and ridiculing, again, an aspect of the public theater. Children run along and laugh and participate as well. Undocumented in any document I've seen over the years is what happens next. That's Molotov in the picture there. At the end of the procession, when they get in front of the maximum security NKVD prison, where inside about 2,800 corpses are, of victims of Soviet power, they kill the pig, and at that moment, a pogrom is set to begin. And now I will take you through that. This is to show you the streets and the contrast. The rituals of self-cleansing, as the Germans call them, this is Reinhard Heydrich's own expression, begin at this point, and I'll go through them very quickly. Basically what happens, and I think this is, I do have to do this film. They post the advertisement asking able-bodied men to come, and then they round them up in the effort to cause attack. I slowed it down by about 50%, so you see the rounding up. And then you see the members of the crowd taking an active part, rounding up Jews in the area just down next to Zamartinovska Street. Now I'll return to the photo series and bring it to an end in a moment. We go back to the original 27 photos. You see the German presence everywhere, something that is not part of the reports generally. The 3,000 Jews are put into a holding area in a courtyard adjacent to the maximum security prison, and then they are taken out 1, 2, 5, 10 at a time and brought out into the pogrom crowd. And I will not do this one. There's just a film of some of the unspeakable violence. And then this is the kind of thing that was going on. Women are stripped naked and then beaten to death. And why they have to be stripped naked, we don't know yet. But you see, again, people doing selfies. If you look into the crowd, you see that people bring cudgels to beat Jews to death. When they come for the Poles in 1944, they come with long knives. You kill an ethnic Polish enemy with knives. You kill Jews with clubs. I've covered up the nakedness of the victims. This woman is running down the street at the end of the street, up a hill. On that street, in that square, currently stands a memory of the 2,800 who died inside the NKVD prison. No mention of the Jewish Holocaust or the pogrom that came afterwards. She's running up that street and she's being chased. By whom? By Ukrainian Boy Scouts. Teenage boys, as their parents stand by watching, chase after her and beat her to death as part of this initiation, if you will, into the pogrom. Having the initial template and a sense of the pogrom violence itself. It looks like spontaneous violence when you look at the films. The reality is it's all part of a larger theater laid out by the Germans themselves, is my argument. I've looked at the essays of Ukrainian policemen. Without exception, the policemen typically are between ages 30 and 35, and the typical handwritten essay is like the one up on the screen, Telapko Mikhailo, Ukrainian, indicating that he wanted to become a policeman under the Germans in order to get revenge against Jews and the Poles. They are specifically trying to bring in genocidal tendencies as part of the occupation police. How does that fit in with other material? It took about 12 years, but eventually I was able to begin to identify certain leaders in the crowd. For instance, this one, Kovalishin, age 30, unmarried. Without exception, these early perpetrators are unmarried because they had been trained at Zakopane, an SS maximum or special militia training ground that prided itself in using real Jews to teach people how to commit genocide. Eventually, that school would move to Robka in southeastern Poland, where I've taken students in dialogues for 2 years now. This one of mugging for the crowd, one Mikita Datsuk, a 23-year-old young man who's quite proud of himself, the first cousin of another Datsuk who's going to come up in a few moments. He himself. And then we have Piecharski also. And we're able to identify each of these individuals and then kind of backward research into the Ukrainian KGB files in some cases. One of the most notorious of the participants of another pogrom, there's no direct link yet, I was able to get Datsuk's files, the person who circled here, gave testimony to his best friend, a Polish friend, about what he was after. He said from 7 to 9 November 1941, another mass action of the German authorities in which the police take part, he talks about this guy, Georg Datsuk. Datsuk told me that at first it was uncomfortable for him to shoot defenseless people, moreover ones that were naked and lying on the ground face down. Among those whom he, Datsuk, shot were several of his acquaintances, Jewish girls with whom he had met earlier on social occasions, some with whom he had even studied at school. I met 2 members of this community, and that's how I began to flesh out the details about Datsuk. A very nice kid, a good Ukrainian boy, never showed any tendencies towards hatred, and in one case, Kaya Musman from Rovna, she broke into tears, just tremendous tears when she found out that Datsuk had been a murderer. She had heard the rumor but didn't know it was him. But Datsuk said he had to shoot even them, these girls that he knew. It was the norm. Datsuk continued to develop a taste for blood, for murder. An older policeman, I do not now recall his name, showed him by example how to do it, and then Datsuk began to fire next, to shoot into the backs of their heads and to throw the bodies into the pit. They did not shoot the children. They didn't want to waste the bullets, and instead just hurled them live directly into the pit. I have survived horrors, said Datsuk, even Job never faced. That sense of perpetrators as victims is the best lesson I want to leave with you. Nobody is born and dreams of someday becoming a perpetrator. Once they do, they justify it in some way. Datsuk manages to justify it by basically arguing that the Germans let him go through the bodies. He's now become a very rich man, and this is why we're justified in crossing this line. It's obviously a difficult thing to do in such a short time, but I hope I've given you some insight into perpetrators and victims during one of the most heinous moments in the early war in the East in July 41. Thank you.
I'm Lori Lefkowitz. I direct the Humanities Center and the Jewish Studies program here at Northeastern. I want to thank you personally and in my roles for starting your week and starting your morning in this way, and for the very powerful presentations that we heard today. People who have devoted themselves to researching and devoting their research energy to recovering and presenting to us and teaching about the individual events and individual people who were victims of this particular atrocity. Often those people, as our dean said, are washed up in the enormous numbers associated not only with this genocide, but with all the genocides of our world. Among those numbers in this genocide actually embraced my own grandparents and the children who had been my father's brothers and sisters. I want to thank the President's office and the Dean's office for supporting our week of remembrance and genocide prevention. And I want to close by saying, and I want to thank also Megan Brisson, who does so much of the work associated with bringing these programs together, and everyone on the Holocaust Awareness Committee, including Jenny Sartori, the other Associate Director of Jewish Studies. There's a week of events. I hope you will attend as much as you possibly can. And I just want to close by saying that we do this work. Northeastern has been doing this work since 1977, presenting a week of programming. And the library is now creating a permanent archive of all those years of programs. But very explicitly in our mission is to present this to this community in order to prevent genocide. And I think back in 1977, when this project began, people did not